There were other such incidents, greater or lesser in degree, but I never saw any yoga, and suffered no ill effects from being the custodian of the Purple Sapphire, which gradually acquired a romantic and rather fearsome interest among my friends. I pass on to the night when I gave a dinner party, which we shall all of us remember to our dying days. The Purple Sapphire by Edward Heron-Allen, writing as Christopher Blair, told to you by Edward E. French. We were 8. B, a rising young author, and a charming young actress, Miss C, of whom he was the temporary enamorate, to quote Burton of the Anatomy, his sister, married, and G, a man in the Foreign Office, asked on account of one another, Mrs., I will call her Smith, as she comes back into the story later on under tragic and unforgettable circumstances, and Mrs. A and her husband, recently married after a double divorce. Mrs. A was a queer woman. It might be said that she had not an enemy in the world, but was rather disliked by all her friends. She dabbled in occultism and led her rather sheepish husband reluctantly to seances. She liked to flatter herself that she was a strong medium. She interested me, but I always regarded her as a fraud. A semi-unconscious fraud, perhaps. But we had a jolly dinner, and afterwards congregated in the library. Mrs. A, as usual, forced the conversation upon the occult. She talked very well, and was always rather thrilling to people who had not heard it all before. B said suddenly, I say, Arkwright, haven't you got a wonderful jewel or something that evokes spooks and murders people in their sleep? At once there was a chorus of delighted curiosity, and finally I produced the Purple Sapphire, which sparkled with remarkable vividness that night. At that moment, one of those things that happened to the electric light happened. It is, I believe, when they changed the accumulators or the dynamo at the generating station. At any rate, the lights went down to about half their normal candle power. The Purple Sapphire seemed to flame even more brilliantly in the subdued light. Oh, do give it to me, exclaimed Miss C, and with a view to making light of the whole thing, I tossed it into her lap. She immediately held her hands up and away from it as if it had been a spider or a mouse, and shrieked to B, who was sitting beside her, Take it away! Take it away! B picked it out of her lap and handed it back to me. After this she sat closer to him for the rest of the evening, holding one of his hands in both of hers. Give it to me, said Mrs. A in her most impressive tone. I am accustomed to these things. I gave it to her, and she laid it with the cover flaps open on her knee. She began to yarn about maleficent talismans, but the evening was spoilt. We were all uneasy. Mrs. Smith alone did not say a word, but sat looking at the Purple Sapphire, and at me in turns. Presently the preliminary murmurs of impending departure arose, and then some amazing things happened. Mrs. A leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Then she cried out, Something is coming. Something is here! Everybody, except Sir Clement, go out of the room. They all sprang to their feet and scuttled into the hall. Mrs. A said in a stifled voice, Oh, God, and fainted. At that moment the disturbance at the main righted itself, and the electric lights blazed up again. I went to the door and called A. Your wife has fainted, I said. Come in. He came in, and with him Mrs. Smith, uninvited. The rest were whispering together in the hall. Mrs. A's eyes were now open, and she said, It fell upon me. It fell through me. With one hand she was still holding the Purple Sapphire on her knee. We comforted and reassured her as best we could, but she declared that something had fallen into her lap and disappeared. It went through me, she said, over and over again. We got her onto her feet, and to prove to her that she was mistaken, we pushed back the low armchair in which she had been sitting. On the floor beneath it lay a small scarlet disk, faintly luminous in the strong light, about 2.5 inches in diameter, on which were figured in black, exactly as on the flat top of the Purple Sapphire, the sign and letters of the Tau. We all gazed at it, horror-struck. I was the first to pull myself together. I got the tongs from the fireplace, with a confused idea of picking the thing up and flinging it into the fire. But even as we 4 looked at it, it turned white and clear of markings, and appeared to volatilize. The others came in. and then they went away. As a newspaper report would say, the meeting broke up in confusion. They did not all go away, though. Mrs. Smith remained. I may say at once that round this lady for some time my thoughts had been concentrated. I shall write of her again. We talked, she and I, long into the night. At 2 a.m. a ring came at the front door, and I opened it. It was Mr. B. He said, "What am I to do with Marie C? She won't go home. We've been driving all over London in a hansom. She's there now, outside. She says she dare not go home to her rooms alone. Damn your infernal stone." I might have remarked that it was he who had insisted on his entry upon the scene. I forbore, however, and in the end Mrs. Smith came out and took Miss C home to her house to sleep with her. B walked home, and I went to bed, I confess, rather shaken up. As Mrs. Smith left, she put her hands on my shoulders and looked into my eyes searchingly. The others had gone outside. "Didn't you see the Indian man squatting on the floor behind Mrs. A's chair?" "No, I didn't." "I swear to you he was there. Please don't go back and sit in the library. Promise me." I promised her. Indeed, I do not think anything would have induced me to do so. As I say, I went to bed. I was out to lunch next day, and on my return home, I found a letter waiting for me, delivered by P.O. Express. It was from A. In it, he wrote, "I feel I must send you the sequel to last night's extraordinary occurrences. About 3 a.m. my wife woke me and said that something was burning her where the jewel had lain upon her knee. I tried to soothe her to sleep, but she insisted so strongly that we switched on the light and turned down the bedclothes. Sure enough, those letters round a capital T were burnt black upon and through her nightgown. We cut out the piece, and I enclose it herewith, and on her leg exactly the same thing, bright red, as if done with a hot iron. We dressed it with Vaseline, but it is there this morning. We will show it to you when you like." To avoid returning to this matter, I may say that Mrs. A. wears this brand to this day. She makes no bones about showing it to people, and I need hardly say that her account of my dinner party does not lose in the telling. Her enemies say she did it herself with a red-hot needle. Her husband says that he always knows, when she puts on her daintiest lingerie, that she's going to tell someone the story of the purple sapphire, as far as she knows it. I now reach the dark and terrible part of my record. I have intimated that I was deeply devoted to Mrs. Smith, who was one of the most beautiful, the cleverest, and by virtue of her husband's wealth, one of the most fastidiously luxurious women in London society, which was literally, as the saying goes, at her feet, which were exquisite. We had a vast community of interest, and were as inseparable as a decent regard for conventionality permitted us to be. I do not think I flatter myself when I say that I must have been a relief after her husband. As to that gentleman, I was, and am, no doubt, prejudiced, but he combined in himself the millionaire, the lout, the drunkard, and the fool. I was ultra-careful never to compromise Mrs. Smith in any way, for, as I repeatedly warned her, I would not have trusted her husband out of my sight for a moment, and was always prepared for him to lay some dirty trap or other for her. He encouraged our friendship, however, and threw us together continually, timeo donaos. It made me, therefore, very uncomfortable and very unhappy when Cecile, at our next meeting, after my dinner party, next day in point of fact, implored me to give her the purple sapphire. Though I had no fear of the thing myself, I was frankly horror-struck at the idea of passing it into her possession. She argued with me. How she argued! "You brag about your invariable luck," she said. "Well, look at me. Am I not the luckiest woman in London by common consent? In everything but my marriage. Am I not brave? Then why do you want me to be a coward? I thought you were brave. Then why are you a coward now? You do not believe the thing is bewitched. Then why do you behave like this now? I have never asked you for anything since we first met, have I? And now that I do beg a gift of you, you refuse it. Be very sure, my friend, that I shall never under any circumstances ask you for anything again. No, not if I was starving in the gutter." These words came back to me most bitterly when she was starving in the gutter, and when she did come to me for help. But what was I to do? One is only flesh and blood, after all, and in certain circumstances, ce qui est femme vert. In the end, I gave her the purple sapphire. I will pass as quickly as I can over the miserable history which followed. Men and women of my generation have not forgotten the splendor and decadence of Cecile Smith. In a phrase, everything went wrong with her. Her whole nature changed. She became hard, reckless, unsympathetic. She gambled frenetically and lost vast sums. She got money to pay her debts by every means, fair and foul. She bought fabulous jewels, her transactions with which would have landed her in jail had not her friends accommodated the situations into which she recklessly flung herself. People whispered of lovers of low degree, of orgies, of drink, of drugs, of all the degenerate horrors of a decadent civilization. And meanwhile Smith was on the watch to jerk the rope when she had had rope enough to hang a score of women. This was not the affair of a moment. It took 2 years. All that time, though we seldom met now, for our paths had widely separated, I was continually imploring her to give me back the purple sapphire. I believed in it fundamentally at last. But she would not. She clung to it with a superstitious obstinacy. In a letter from St. Petersburg, where she had drifted as partner in a gambling enterprise, which failed, of course, she wrote, "The stone is the last thing I had when I was queen of my race, and I was queen. It is the only thing I ever asked you for. Nothing shall part me from it. P.S. The yoga is here all right. Thank God he costs nothing for railway fares and hotel expenses." Once, in reply to a passionate appeal for money from Madrid, I offered her £1,000 for it. Same result. Time went on. We heard of her occasionally, twice that she was in prison. I was very unhappy about her, worn out indeed, but there was nothing to be done. To distract my thoughts, I went an aimless voyage round the world, on which I met the lady who is now my wife. I returned to England in the spring of 1852. Passing through Paris, I read to my horror that an unknown woman who had shot herself in a tenement house in La Villette a few weeks before had now been identified as the once beautiful and notorious Mrs. Smith of London, Paris, Rome, St. Petersburg, and where not. It was a ghastly shock, and in spite of the light that was breaking on my own horizon, I returned to London a sad and distracted man. A huge correspondence awaited me that my secretary had been incompetent to deal with in my absence. Among the heap was an official packet. It was from our consul in Paris. The letter said, "The enclosed packet sealed up and addressed to you was found among the effects of the late Mrs. Smith, who, you may have heard, died recently in this city in tragic circumstances. Kindly acknowledge, etc., etc." It was the purple sapphire. Wrapped round it was a slip of paper on which Cecile had written, "It has drowned me. Take it back. I have tried to sell it, but no one will buy it. Even thieves won't have it. Sayonara. Ave ut qua val. Cecile." And so it came back. A month later, when I had settled down, burglars got into my house and carried off property of great value, including the purple sapphire. They left me on the floor of my dining room with a bullet in my neck which all but closed my earthly record. As soon as I was convalescent, that is to say about 6 weeks afterwards, I found that the burglars had been apprehended as the result of another burglary, the last of a long series perpetrated by this particular gang, which had hitherto completely baffled the police. Their mastermind had had a serious accident when on a professional tour and had been arrested. The rest of the gang fell out among themselves, and partly by treachery and partly by mismanagement, the burglary for which they were awaiting trial, which had been postponed for my evidence, proved to be their last. It was the only beneficent action which can be laid to the score of the purple sapphire. After these unhappy men had been sentenced, the solicitor in charge of the defense handed me a small packet. I knew without asking what it was. He accompanied the restoration with the words, "My clients instructed me to return this to you. It is the only one of your jewels which they were unable to dispose of. They attribute, you know criminals are notoriously superstitious, solely to it the unfortunate position in which they find themselves today. It was, in fact, their unaccountably rash efforts to get rid of it that gave the police the clue they've been seeking for a year past." And so it came back, and from that moment things began to go wrong all round. My power to control the purple sapphire was gone. My solicitor absconded with a loss to me of several thousands of pounds which he had in his hands for investment. I also broke a leg and a collarbone riding along a simple country path. I spare you the rest of the catalogue of disasters, major and minor. They were many and varied. I set about the task of getting rid of the purple sapphire. I sold it to a second-hand jeweler in Wardour Street, who knew me well, but did not the less on that account offer me the value of a common Scotch amethyst of the same size. A week later, he brought it back, saying that his wife, who was Scotch, to whom he had given it, would not have it in the house. She had a scunner on it. I pawned it for £2. A month later the pawnbroker failed, and his trustee in bankruptcy sent it back to me, as the sum for which it had been pledged was obviously inadequate, and he felt it his duty, etc., etc. Finally, I took it to the National Museum of Cosmopoly and offered it as a gift to the keeper of jewels. He turned it over and over, looking at me curiously, as I thought, and then said, "This is a marvelous jewel. We have nothing like it, and you may think it odd, but I don't think we want it." "For heaven's sake, why?" I asked. "You will think it odd, but I am a firm believer in the malevolence of certain stones which have been the witnesses or causes of tragedies. Why do you want to get rid of it?" There was no help for it. I was too broken in spirit, I told him. He listened very attentively, and when I had finished, with a suggestion that I should smash it up and scatter the fragments, he said, "No, don't do that. As it is, you know it. You can recognize it and can be on your guard. If you smash it, it will come back to you somehow, in pieces, recut, that you will not recognize, and you may unconsciously hurt someone. Now, do not think that I am mad, though I admit that my colleagues in the museum think I am, to say the least of it, eccentric upon this subject, but you must follow the direction of the old books on magic and witchcraft. There is much more in them than most people think or will admit. You must drop this into a tidal river at the exact moment of dead high water. It is the only thing you can do. And I warn you that even that may fail." I confess I felt extraordinarily relieved at the suggestion. This surely must be final. We got out a nautical almanac and calculated the time of dead high water in the Thames on a particular day, and on that day, and at that minute, I dropped the purple sapphire into the river from the middle of Charing Cross Bridge. All went well with me for about 3 months. The happiness I had seen approaching on my world tour seemed well on its way to realization. My nerves regained their equilibrium. Life was once more worth living. Then one day, as I was working in my library, my parlor maid announced, "A man with a note from Mr. X." This was my jeweler friend in Wardour Street. The note said, "The bearer has a curious jewel for sale, which was once in your possession. I do not know how he may have come by it, but I send him to you as you may care either to repurchase the article of which he does not know the value, or to hand him over to the police." I looked up, and the man, a common working navvy, produced from a wrapping of dirty rag the purple sapphire. I was stunned. I sat looking stupidly at the accursed thing, and it seemed to me as if someone else's voice said to the man, "Where did you get this from?" He began a whining rigmarole. It had been in his family from father to son for many generations. They had come down in the world. He had come to London to seek work, had got it, good work, highly paid. But he had lost it. Luck had turned against him. One of his children had died. His wife was ill. They were starving. At last, with great reluctance, they had decided to sell the old amethyst. That's what his father had said it was. Worth lots of money. He had taken it to Mr. X, and Mr. X had sent him to me as I was a gent who gave good money for curios. My interruption startled him. I sprang to my feet and shouted at him, "You liar! Come, governor, none of that. Give me back my curio. Not till I've got the truth out of you. If you try to get away, I give you to the police outside. Now then, out with it. How did you get this out of the bed of the Thames?" "Christ! It's witchcraft. That's what it is. Devils and that. It's just bloody witchcraft." "You see," said I know something. You had better tell me the rest. It took him several minutes to recover his normal self, and then he told me. It was amazing. The extraordinary network of underground railways, the tubes they came to be called later, was just beginning to be constructed. One of them passed under the Thames from Charing Cross to Waterloo Station. This man was employed in the caissons under the river mud, pushing forward foot by foot in compressed air chambers, digging out the riverbed and passing the debris back to shore. He had caught the glint of this thing in one of the scoops as it came home, and watching his opportunity, he, to use his own words, pinched it and pouched it. "I give you my word, Governor," the wretch went on, "I've never had a good hour since. It's the first thing ever I pinched, and it's got back on me. I've tried to sell it. No one will buy it from the likes of me. I've tried to lose it. It's brought back to me. I believe the police is after me on account of it. For God's sake, mister, take it off my hands." My heart went out to the poor devil. "I know the stone," I said. "I lost it. I'll take it back. Here's a $5 for you. Go home and good luck to you. You'll get along better now." His gratitude was pathetic. "I feel better already, Governor," he said. "God knows it'll be a lesson to me." And so it came back. I knew now that any effort of mine to get rid of it would be in vain, and I decided that after all it would be better to know where it was than to dispose of it and feel that any day or hour it might turn up again. So I wrapped it up in a piece of Indian muslin in which George Cardew had given it to me and put it in its nest of boxes. I have forgotten in writing this to record that shortly after Colonel George made it over to me, he sent me a nest of 7 sandalwood boxes of Indian make, fitting closely inside one another, the smallest and innermost of which exactly held the purple sapphire. Whether he or his father or Dr. Dick had made them, I never knew, or if I did, I have forgotten. I then wrote a note of instruction to the executors of my will, directing that the purple sapphire should not see the light of day until 25 years had elapsed after my death. I little supposed that by that time its power for evil would have, so to speak, evaporated, but at any rate I could make sure that it should not fall into the hands of my children, if I had any, until they were old enough to have read this manuscript and to judge for themselves what was the next thing to be done with it. The professor of mineralogy has transcribed this letter of instructions in the early sheets of his record, so it is not necessary to repeat it here. C.B. With a view to enforcing the performance of my wish, I set aside by my will a sum of £10,000, the income of which followed my residuary estate, with a provision that, in the event of the parcel having been opened before the prescribed time, the capital sum was to be transferred at once to one of our larger hospitals. I felt that the governors of that hospital would keep an eye upon the parcel and see from time to time that it was intact. At the end of the 25 years, the £10,000 is to fall into residue. I wrapped it up and sealed the parcel and took it to my bankers, where I deposited it for safe custody in their vaults. The manager, a charming man and a personal friend of mine, received it in the ordinary way, and I need hardly say that I did not give him any inkling of its contents or of my motives for the deposit. Whether it was a coincidence or otherwise, I cannot tell, but from that moment the affairs of that branch of my bank went wrong in many ways. One of the cashiers absconded with a large sum of money. Loans which the bank had made went wrong. Commercial houses which they had financed failed and involved them in heavy losses. And of course the manager got the blame, and he was forced into retirement on a small pension, a broken and disappointed man. I had my own uncomfortable ideas on the subject, but it was obvious that I could not go to the head office and say it was all my fault for having deposited in the vaults a parcel containing the purple sapphire. They would rightly have assumed that my brain was softening. And there it lies to this day. I am happily married and have 2 charming children, a girl and a boy. I sometimes wonder whether it will be he or his son upon which will devolve the awful responsibility of taking the purple sapphire from its resting place. Clement Arkwright, 31st December 1863. The manuscript of Sir Clement Arkwright stopped here. He lived for many years after the date which he appended. There follows in the notebook a further entry in another hand which reads, 1st January 1920. 25 years since the death of my brother expired yesterday, and I went to the bank and claimed the parcel, which we found, the manager and I, dusty but intact. I opened it in his presence and read the letter of instructions, but I did not open the sandalwood boxes. I'm not superstitious, but somehow well, at any rate, I did not open them. We wrapped up and resealed the parcel and left it again where it had lain for over 40 years. I must record, by way of postscript to my brother's account, a curious and to me very ominous circumstance. During the Great War, the staff of the bank, those of military age, that is to say, had been largely replaced by women, several of whom are still in the employ of the bank. As the manager was seeing me to the door, I said to him, "I suppose you'll be gradually getting rid of these young ladies?" "Yes," replied he, "and I shall be very glad when we see the last of them. One can never rely upon their work. Their hearts are not in it, for they know that it is not their life's work, and that they can never rise to the administrative grades in the service. They make the most annoying mistakes, and one has to have their work continually checked by the men. And as a culminating touch, what do you think? There's a mad idea among them that makes them absolutely refuse to go down into the vaults when we want to send for anything. They say the vaults are haunted. 2 of them, we've got rid of them, declared that they had seen an apparition of a naked Indian who grinned and gibbered at them down there. Did you ever hear of such hysterical idiocy? Oh, I shall be glad to get rid of them." I said nothing beyond what might be conventionally expected of me, but I drove home feeling very uncomfortable. Is this horrible thing, after lying quiet for 40 years, going to wake into renewed activity? I suppose I ought to deliver it to my nephew and godson, Sir Gilbert Arkwright, but frankly I'm afraid to do so. Fortunately, he is still abroad, in the Army of Occupation in Germany. I shall let matters rest as they are until he comes home. Gilbert Arkwright. Following upon this was a further entry in the same hand, which reads as follows. 23rd June, 1920. My nephew Gilbert has returned home, and I have made him read this record in his father's hand. He is a splendid fellow, and he laughs, of course, at the whole thing. At any rate, he said, let us take it out and have a look at it. I begged him not to insist upon anything of the kind, and at last, after many long arguments, which I fear have convinced him that I am suffering from senile decay, he has consented to the plan which I have proposed. This is, that I should take the parcel just as it is to the professor of mineralogy in the University of Cosmopolis and present it to the University Museum. It may be presumed, or at least hoped, that, placed among a large collection, many specimens in which may possibly have histories no less mysterious than that of the purple sapphire, its evil powers may be, as it were, diluted, if not dissipated. In any case, I take it to the university tomorrow, and there I sincerely trust that, so far as our family is concerned, the history of the purple sapphire is at an end. Gilbert Arkwright. It was very late when I had finished reading through the pages of the black notebook. The handwriting of the main record left much to be desired in places, having evidently been written under the influence of strong emotion. And no wonder. I felt that the writer was compelling himself to a violent effort all the time, omitting much, passing lightly over incidents which it must have been very painful for him to record. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart. Next day I went up to the museum and looked at the purple sapphire. There it lay, appropriately labeled Sapphire, Purple, Illumina Corundum. Refraction, 86 degrees 4 inches. Hardness, 9 point. SP, point, GR, point. 3.9-4.16. A bald description of what is perhaps the most remarkable stone in the collection. There is no reason why any student should ever refer to the little black notebook, but I do sometimes wonder whether anyone browsing among the shelves of the library will ever take it down and read these records. And then I wonder many things. Christopher Blair, sometime registrar of the university. The Purple Sapphire by Edward Heron-Allen, Writing is Christopher Blair. It's told to you by Edward E. French. A copyright exists on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Inquiries should be addressed to Permissions Manager at email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. Good night.